What if I told you that on the very day meant to honor the memory of Queen Elizabeth, the monarch who held the United Kingdom together through war, scandal, and decades of shifting times, her own grandson allegedly showed up uninvited, sparking a moment so explosive that even seasoned royal watchers gasped. Imagine this. Princess Anne, the woman known for her discipline, her no-nonsense approach, her iron loyalty to the crown, turns in front of gathered mourners and hisses the words no one expected. "You destroyed the Queen." Then, without hesitation, she calls security to remove him. How do we even begin to process such a scene? Can you picture the silence falling over Windsor, the clash of tradition against betrayal, and the sting of humiliation that echoed across the world within minutes? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Let's rewind. Because before we get to that unforgettable moment, you need to understand why it mattered so deeply. Why Harry's appearance, intentional or not, struck a nerve raw enough to spark Anne's fury. You see, this wasn't just about a man turning up at an event. This was about history. This was about memory. And more than anything, this was about the lingering shadow of a queen whose absence has left her family fractured. For 70 years, Queen Elizabeth embodied constancy. Through wars, divorces, scandals, and a world that seemed to change by the minute, she stood immovable. The nation trusted her. The Commonwealth adored her. Even critics respected her restraint. And when she passed, it wasn't just a family that lost its matriarch. It was a country, a symbol, an anchor. 3 years later, that grief hasn't faded. If anything, it has sharpened, like glass under pressure. Which is why the events on this anniversary hit harder than anyone could have imagined. But let's be real. This isn't just about grief. It's about betrayal. It's about the wounds Harry inflicted through interviews, books, Netflix specials that still bleed in the public's mind. How many times did we hear him slam his family, accuse them of coldness, racism, and cruelty? And yet, here he was, standing in the very place that symbolized everything he walked away from. Doesn't that make you wonder? Was he naive, defiant, or simply desperate? Picture the scene. The chapel filled with hushed voices. Courtiers and family members draped in dark, respectful attire. Flowers laid with precision. Photographs of the Queen radiating dignity. And then, Harry arrives. No official invitation. No fanfare. Just the heavy air of tension that followed him like a second skin. Would you have stayed away, knowing you weren't wanted? Or would you have gone anyway, convinced you still belonged? The whispers began immediately. Some gasped. Others shook their heads. And at the heart of it all was Princess Anne. Now, Anne is not someone who indulges in theatrics. If anything, she has spent her entire life avoiding them. Practical, dutiful, almost famously blunt. But on this day, her patience snapped. Why? Because to her, and to many others, Harry's presence wasn't about respect. It wasn't about honoring his grandmother. It was about optics, about forcing himself into a narrative he no longer owned. And that's when she spoke the words that would send shockwaves through the monarchy. "You destroyed the Queen." Can you feel the weight of those words? They cut deeper than any tabloid headline, sharper than any public statement. They weren't just about Meghan, about scandals, about Netflix deals. They were about legacy, about how Elizabeth's final years were clouded with turmoil, and how Harry played his part in that storm. The tension was unbearable. People froze. No one dared interrupt. Even Charles, the king himself, sat rigid, his face carved in stone. William looked down, lips pressed tight. And Harry? His eyes widened, his body stiff, his voice trembling with protest that no one seemed willing to hear. It wasn't just a confrontation. It was an execution. But here's where it gets even more shocking. And didn't stop there. With a motion of her hand, she turned to security. Imagine the collective intake of breath, the disbelief flooding the room. Was she really going to do it? Was she really about to have her own nephew escorted out on the anniversary of his grandmother's death? Yes, that's exactly what she did. And that, right there, is the moment that history will never forget. Think about it. A royal family already plagued with scandal, now fractured further in the open, in front of witnesses who would tell the world within hours. Headlines were already writing themselves. Social media was ready to explode. But inside that hallowed space, in that fragile, grief-stricken gathering, the meaning was crystal clear. This wasn't just about Harry. It was about loyalty. It was about who still belonged and who didn't. So ask yourself, if you were in Anne's shoes, what would you have done? Would you have held your tongue and let the cameras spin their own narrative? Or would you have stood up for the Queen's memory, no matter the cost? Because Anne chose the latter. And what happened next, after Harry's stunned silence, after the cold stares and whispered judgment, would ensure this moment wasn't just a family spat. It was a rupture so deep it would echo for years. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does it mean for a queen to die? Not just a monarch, but the monarch, the longest reigning ruler in British history, the woman who carried the weight of a nation on her shoulders for 70 years. 3 years have passed since Queen Elizabeth II was laid to rest, yet her presence lingers in every hallway of Windsor Castle, in every ritual, in every whispered memory. It's almost as if the walls themselves mourn her absence, carrying the echo of her voice, her unwavering steadiness, her silent but firm authority. But here's the truth. Death doesn't erase legacy, it sharpens it. And Elizabeth's ghost doesn't haunt the monarchy with comfort, it haunts it with judgment. Every move her children and grandchildren make now seems measured against her shadow. Did she uphold dignity? Did she protect the crown? Did she preserve stability? For Anne, the Queen's only daughter, the answer is always a resolute yes. For Harry, however, the answer feels more complicated. 3 years later, her death isn't just remembered, it's politicized. It's weaponized. And on this third anniversary, the divisions that tore through the House of Windsor haven't healed. They've widened. Think about the last days of Elizabeth's reign, surrounded by family turmoil, plagued with Meghan and Harry's revelations, overshadowed by scandal after scandal. Even her Platinum Jubilee, a moment that should have been pure triumph, was marred by whispers of tension, icy glares, and the absence of the very grandson who once made her beam with pride. And this wasn't just unfortunate timing. It was betrayal. So why does her ghost matter here? Because on this anniversary, her memory was supposed to unite. Instead, it divided. Picture Windsor on that somber day. Black cars rolled quietly through ancient gates. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional rustle of flags at half-mast. Courtiers whispered logistics, attendees adjusted their coats against the autumn chill. Every movement, every ritual, was designed to honor Elizabeth's life, a life of duty, sacrifice, and restraint. But in the shadows of that solemnity lurked questions. Would Harry come? Should he come? Was there even a place for him anymore? This is the crux of Elizabeth's ghost. Her death did not resolve the family's conflict. It magnified it. The monarchy was meant to be a symbol of continuity, and yet here it was, splintered before the world's eyes. And felt this most deeply. Of all the Queen's children, she was the one who most embodied her mother's steadiness. Not glamorous, not scandalous, just dutiful. Always. She saw herself as the custodian of Elizabeth's values. And for Anne, those values were non-negotiable. Now contrast that with Harry. The boy who once charmed the world with his cheeky grin, the soldier who earned respect on the battlefield, the grandson who once walked solemnly behind his mother's coffin, embodying resilience. That boy grew into a man who turned his back on tradition, who aired grievances on global platforms, who painted the monarchy as a cage rather than a crown. Elizabeth's ghost whispers these contradictions every time Harry's name is mentioned. To some, he's brave for speaking out. To others, he's reckless for betraying his family. But to Anne, on this anniversary, he was nothing less than an intruder. Do you see the irony? The Queen herself might have shown mercy. She was known for quiet forgiveness, for finding ways to smooth over conflicts without spectacle. She welcomed back Andrew despite scandal. She maintained a public face of unity even when Charles and Diana's marriage collapsed. She believed the monarchy's strength was in its ability to endure quietly, without lashing out. But Anne is not Elizabeth. And that's the ghost again, shaping behavior even in absence. Because in Anne's mind, honoring her mother meant drawing a line in the sand. She saw Harry's arrival not as a gesture of grief, but as a desecration. How could you mourn someone you publicly criticized, someone you used as fodder for your own narrative, someone you arguably helped to break in her final years? This is where the story sharpens. The Queen's death isn't just an anniversary, it's a reckoning. Every year that passes, The monarchy asks itself, are we living up to her example? And when Harry walked through those gates, Anne's answer was an unequivocal no. Let's step back for a moment. Think of other monarchs, other dynasties. History is littered with examples of heirs who clashed with tradition, of family members who became enemies, of ghosts whose legacies haunted generations. The Tudors, the Romanovs, even the Windsors in Edward VIII's time, the shadow of abdication still looms. History tells us this. When a royal house turns inward, when family becomes enemy, it is the ghost of legacy that fuels the fire. Elizabeth's ghost is no different. It is the measure by which Anne judges loyalty, and it is the measure by which Harry fails. The chapel, draped in flowers and memories, wasn't just a place of mourning that day. It was a battlefield. A symbolic one, yes, but a battlefield nonetheless. One side stood for tradition, dignity, and loyalty to the Queen's memory. The other side, whether intentionally or not, represented rebellion, disunity, and betrayal. Which side would win? That was the question lingering in every attendee's mind as Harry slipped into the gathering, eyes searching for acceptance that never came. And in that moment, Anne wasn't just her mother's daughter. She was her mother's avenger. But what happened when Harry crossed that invisible line of legacy? What unfolded next would take this ghost of Windsor and transform it into a living, breathing conflict that no one present could forget. Because as the Queen's shadow loomed over them all, Harry's presence became the spark that lit the fire. And the fire was about to burn hotter than anyone expected. What hurts more, being openly rejected, or being ignored so completely that rejection doesn't even need to be spoken? That was the sting of this anniversary for Prince Harry. Because unlike other members of the royal family, unlike those who received embossed invitations carefully sealed and delivered with all the weight of tradition, Harry received nothing. No letter, no phone call, no acknowledgement, just silence. And silence, in the royal world, speaks louder than words. This anniversary was no casual gathering. It wasn't something one simply dropped in on. Everything about it was designed to reflect precision, protocol, and hierarchy. Guests were listed, vetted, approved. Seating was organized down to the very chair. Schedules were timed to the minute. And Harry? His name was nowhere. He had been erased from the formal roll call of remembrance. Imagine for a moment what that feels like. The Queen, the woman who once doted on you, the grandmother who smiled warmly at your wedding, the monarch who gave you a place in her court, is being honored. Yet you, her grandson, are not wanted. Would you accept that? Or would you fight it? Harry, it seems, chose the latter. But let's pause here. Because the absence of an invitation wasn't just an oversight. It was deliberate. Princess Anne played a key role in these anniversary arrangements. And, meticulous to the core, saw no place for Harry. To her, the message was simple. You left. You attacked us. You cashed in on your grievances. And now, you don't get to stand here and pretend nothing happened. The snub was meant to draw a line. It was her way of protecting her mother's memory from intrusion. But Anne wasn't alone in that sentiment. Other senior royals quietly supported the decision. William, still bitter from Harry's accusations, wasn't about to see his brother welcomed with open arms. Camilla, who endured barbed comments in Harry's memoir, certainly had no interest in sharing space with him on such a solemn day. Even Charles, torn though he may have been, allowed the silence to stand. His inaction was itself an action. Now here's the contradiction. Harry knew. He must have known. Without an invitation, without any formal acknowledgement, he had to be aware that his presence would be unwanted. And yet he showed up. Why? Was it pride? Was it guilt? Was it the belief that, as the Queen's grandson, he still had a right to be there? This is where the story takes a sharp, emotional twist. Because in Harry's mind, being excluded wasn't just about him. It was about Meghan too. Remember, Meghan was never embraced fully by the family, and their joint decision to step back from royal duties left wounds that haven't healed. Harry might have seen this anniversary as a chance to reclaim something, to show that no matter the scandals, he was still part of the bloodline. But Anne saw it differently. To her, his very act of turning up uninvited was proof of arrogance, of entitlement. He doesn't even see what he's done, she reportedly said to those close to her. And in that single perception lay the seed of the confrontation that would erupt later. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever been deliberately excluded from a gathering, left off a guest list, ignored in a family celebration, erased from something that once mattered deeply to you? That sting of rejection burns in a way that words cannot describe. And if you showed up anyway, can you imagine the tension? The awkward glances? The whispered judgments? That's the powder keg Harry walked into. But here's where it gets even more dramatic. In the royal family, everything is layered with symbolism. The absence of an invitation wasn't just a personal slight. It was a public message. Harry is no longer one of us. The crown does not recognize him. The institution does not acknowledge him. And on the day meant to honor Elizabeth, the monarch who believed above all else in duty and loyalty, that exclusion was damning. Yet Harry crossed the threshold anyway. He walked into that space, silent, tense, carrying the weight of knowing he had defied protocol. Every step he took was a step into enemy territory, and was waiting. If the Queen's ghost hung over Chapter 1, then Chapter 2 ends with the silent crackle of conflict about to burst. The lack of invitation was no accident. It was the fuse. And Harry's decision to show up anyway? That was the spark. But what happens when a spark meets fuel? The result is inevitable. And the moment Harry stepped across that sacred line, he ensured that the explosion was coming. Because if being uninvited wasn't enough to keep him away, then the next move would have to be something far more public, far more humiliating. And as he approached the gathering, eyes darting, whispers rising, Princess, and was about to deliver exactly that. It began with a stir at the gates. Not the usual stir that comes with black sedans gliding into Windsor, not the respectful murmurs of recognition as another titled guest made their solemn entrance. This was different. This was sharp, electric, uncomfortable. The kind of stir that makes people whisper before they even know exactly what they're seeing. Because there he was, Prince Harry, uninvited, unannounced, standing at the very gates of Windsor on the 3rd anniversary of Queen Elizabeth's death. Imagine the scene. The guards straightened. Courtiers exchanged looks. Reporters, hungry for any slip of scandal, nearly dropped their pens. No one had expected him. Not today, not here, not after the silence that had spoken louder than any formal exclusion. And yet, here he was, walking with a determination that bordered on defiance, his head held high, but his eyes betraying something else. Was it guilt? Nerves? Pride? Perhaps all three at once. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some whispered his name as if saying it too loudly might shatter the fragile sanctity of the moment. Others frowned, shaking their heads in disbelief. And among them, one sentiment rang clear. Why is he here? That's the question, isn't it? Why did Harry come? After all the accusations, after the Netflix docuseries, after Spare dragged his family through the mud, why show up now, uninvited, to a moment so drenched in reverence? Did he come to pay his respects? Or did he come to reclaim a seat at the table he had abandoned? Now think about the irony. Just 3 years earlier, Harry had walked behind his grandmother's coffin in a display of unity. For a brief moment, the world wondered if grief might bridge the family's divides. But since then, every interview, every confession, every revelation had dug the divide deeper. And on this day, walking into Windsor felt less like respect and more like intrusion. Picture the symbolism. The gates of Windsor, heavy with history, swinging open not for a beloved prince, but for an outcast. Once, those gates represented safety for Harry, a place where he belonged without question. Now, they seemed to groan under the weight of letting him in again. Here's where things get even more dramatic. Harry didn't arrive with fanfare. There was no royal convoy, no coordinated entrance. He came quietly, almost like a man trying to slip in unnoticed, except everyone noticed. He wore a dark suit, his tie slightly askew, his jaw set tight. Every step seemed deliberate, as though he was daring the very ground to reject him. But rejection was already in the air. Inside the gates, the atmosphere shifted the second his figure appeared. Courtiers glanced nervously at one another, unsure whether to acknowledge him or pretend he wasn't there. Distant relatives murmured in hushed tones, some with pity, others with disdain. And in the center of it all, Princess Anne stood rigid, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of him, and knew immediately this was going to be trouble. Let's not forget, Anne has always been the family's guard dog, not in a flashy, headline-grabbing way, but in her quiet, uncompromising loyalty to the institution. To her, Harry's presence was not just inconvenient. It was disrespectful. It was provocative. It was an insult to her mother's memory. And here's a twist. Harry might have known exactly what he was walking into. Some speculate he wanted the confrontation, that by showing up, he was forcing the family to either accept him publicly or humiliate him publicly, both outcomes that, in their own ways, put him back at the center of the story. Ask yourself, was this grief or was this strategy? The gasps didn't stop at the gates. They followed him as he stepped into the courtyard, then into the chapel itself. Every pair of eyes tracked him. The sound of his shoes on stone echoed louder than any hymn. The silence that greeted him was deafening. Not a word of welcome, not a nod of acknowledgement, just a wall of cold, unspoken judgment. Harry, for a brief moment, looked like the boy he once was. Vulnerable, searching, hoping. But then, the mask of resolve slipped back into place. He squared his shoulders, lifted his chin, and carried on. Still, the damage was done. The sacred air of remembrance was broken. What was meant to be a day of unity and mourning had been cracked open by tension. The Queen's ghost, invoked just moments earlier, now hung heavier than ever, as if even she disapproved. And if the guests had gasped at the gates, they hadn't seen anything yet. Because Harry's entrance was only the beginning. The true explosion was waiting inside, where Princess Anne, lips tight and eyes blazing, was preparing to act. And when she did, no one, not even Harry, could have anticipated the storm that would follow. She didn't move at first. That was the most unsettling part. Princess Anne, stiff-backed and stone-faced, stood perfectly still as Harry crossed the threshold. But those who know her best could see it instantly. The tightening of her jaw, the narrowing of her eyes, the way her fingers curled against the fabric of her black dress. Anne was furious, and when Anne is furious, everyone feels it. Remember, Anne isn't a woman who explodes easily. She doesn't indulge in dramatics. She doesn't perform for cameras. Her reputation has always been that of the workhorse, the royal who gets up, does the job, and goes home without fuss. But on that day, watching Harry walk into Windsor uninvited, Anne's iron composure fractured. Why? Because to her, this wasn't just about an unexpected guest. This was about her mother, and had stood closer to Queen Elizabeth than any of her siblings. She mirrored her discipline, inherited her stoicism, lived her entire life by the same motto, duty first, always. For Anne, the Queen wasn't just a mother. She was an institution. And to see Harry, the grandson who had publicly smeared that institution, show up at a memorial without so much as an invitation, it was unforgivable. Let's pause here. Imagine you're Anne. Your mother's memory is sacred, her legacy untouchable. You've spent years holding the line, ensuring her sacrifices were not in vain. And then, the very person who capitalized on her name, who dragged the family through interviews and memoirs, strolls in as though nothing happened. Wouldn't you snap? Anne's fury wasn't loud, not at first. It was a cold fury, the kind that radiates from her like frost spreading over glass. Those near her whispered later that the air itself seemed to change when she saw him. A stiffness rippled through the rows of royals, like soldiers bracing for battle. Harry, oblivious or perhaps willfully blind, took his seat. Heads turned. Some relatives averted their eyes. Others stared openly, and didn't look away. Her gaze locked on him like a hawk sighting prey. And then she moved. Slowly, deliberately, she rose to her feet. Her heels clicked against the stone floor with a rhythm that silenced the murmurs. The weight of centuries of discipline carried in every step. She wasn't rushing, oh no, and didn't need to rush. The power was in her restraint. The tension was in the inevitability. When she reached Harry's row, she stopped. For a long moment, the two simply stared at one another. Nephew and aunt, once bound by family, now divided by betrayal. The chapel, packed with dignitaries and relatives, held its breath. And then Anne spoke. Her voice wasn't raised. It didn't need to be. Each word cut sharper for being calm. What are you doing here? Imagine the sting of that question. Not why are you late? Not how are you? Not even you shouldn't be here. But what are you doing here? As if his very presence was incomprehensible. As if he were a stranger intruding on private grief. Harry, caught off guard, stammered something inaudible. A few words, a half-formed justification. But Anne's eyes didn't soften. If anything, They grew harder. You destroyed the queen. There it was. The fury unleashed, not in a scream, not in theatrics, but in the bluntest of truths. In Anne's mind, Harry's interviews, his memoir, his relentless criticisms had caused Elizabeth pain in her final years. And here he was, daring to mourn the woman he had hurt. The room erupted in silence, the kind of silence that feels deafening, where every heartbeat sounds like thunder. Gasps echoed against the walls. A few people lowered their heads. Others froze, unsure where to look. Harry's face drained of color. His lips parted, as if ready to defend himself, but no words came. What could he say? That it wasn't his fault? That the queen had still loved him? That he had a right to be there? None of those arguments would stand against the weight of Anne's fury. Here's the thing about Anne. She rarely loses her temper. But when she does, it's final. Her words aren't warnings, they're verdicts. And this verdict was clear. Harry was no longer family in her eyes. Think of the irony. And had lived through decades of scandal. Charles and Diana's marriage, Andrew's disgrace, the constant criticism of the monarchy. She had held her tongue through it all. But this? Harry's intrusion on this day, in this place, was the breaking point. And she wasn't finished. Turning sharply, and gestured to the royal security detail standing at the edges of the chapel. For a heartbeat, no one moved, as though they couldn't believe what they were witnessing. But Anne's glare was enough. Security stepped forward. In that moment, Harry wasn't a prince. He wasn't family. He was an unwanted guest. And Anne, with all the authority of her mother's daughter, was making sure the world knew it. Would you have had the courage to do what Anne did? Or would you have swallowed your fury, pretended everything was fine, and allowed history to repeat itself in silence? And chose confrontation. And as the guards closed in around Harry, the tension hit a breaking point. What would he do? Would he leave quietly, tail between his legs? Or would he fight back, daring to defy his aunt in the very house of his grandmother's memory? The answer would shock everyone in that room. Because the fury wasn't over. It was only just beginning. It was the line that tore through the chapel like a thunderclap. Not whispered, not softened, delivered with the cutting precision only Princess Anne could muster. You destroyed the queen. For a moment, time itself seemed to pause. The flicker of candlelight froze in place. The air hung thick, unmoving. Even the guards, summoned by Anne's sharp gesture, hesitated mid-step as if they too needed a second to process what had just been said. Those 5 words were more than an accusation. They were an indictment. They carried the weight of history, the raw pain of grief, and the fury of a daughter still protecting her mother's legacy. Let's dissect this. And wasn't just calling Harry a disappointment. She was holding him personally responsible for the suffering Queen Elizabeth endured in her twilight years. Every Netflix confession, every podcast revelation, every tabloid headline dragged her mother's name into chaos. The Queen, a woman who had built her reign on silence and dignity, was forced to live her final years with whispers of betrayal hanging over Buckingham Palace. And now, and spat it out for the world to hear. Harry, you did this. The reaction was visceral. Some in the crowd gasped audibly. A woman clutched her pearls. A dignitary shifted uncomfortably, his gaze fixed on the floor. Across the aisle, William stiffened, lips pressed into a bloodless line. Charles sat stone-faced, his eyes flickering not with shock, but with weary recognition. He had heard versions of this before, just never this raw, never this public. And Harry? Harry froze. His face paled. His jaw clenched, then loosened, then clenched again as if searching for words that refused to come. His eyes darted around the room, desperate for someone, anyone, to step in, to shield him, to speak on his behalf. But no one did. Not this time. Would you have spoken up in his shoes? Would you have tried to defend yourself? Or would you have stayed silent, knowing that any excuse might only make it worse? Harry attempted it. That's not fair, he murmured, his voice trembling but audible enough for the room to catch. I loved her. Anne's head snapped back toward him, her eyes blazing. Loved her, she shot back, her voice now edged with steel. You tormented her. You turned her into a spectacle. And now you come here, uninvited, to parade your grief? No, not here. Not today. The words were a dagger, twisted without mercy. The tension was unbearable, stretching to a breaking point where even the air seemed to crack. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, caught between the sanctity of mourning and the brutality of truth unfolding before them. And then, the unthinkable happened, and turned again to security. This time, her command was unmistakable. "Escort him out." Gasps rippled through the chapel. The queen's only daughter was ordering her mother's grandson, once one of the most beloved figures in the royal family, out of the memorial service. And not privately, not behind closed doors, but in full view of relatives, courtiers, dignitaries, and whispered witnesses who would carry this story to every corner of the globe. The guard stepped forward. Their expressions were carefully neutral, but their movements told the truth. This was unprecedented. Never before had a royal family member been so publicly treated as an outsider, not even in the darkest days of scandal. Harry rose from his seat, his face etched with disbelief. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice louder now, almost desperate. "This is my grandmother. I have a right to be here." And didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She simply stared at him with that same cold fury, her silence more damning than any retort. The symbolism was brutal. In that moment, Harry was no longer a prince, no longer a grandson. He was a trespasser, a man whose claim to family had been revoked in the most public way imaginable. And here's the question that hung heavy in the minds of everyone watching. Was it wrong? Or was she simply saying out loud what many in the royal family had long believed, that Harry had forfeited his place the moment he chose to betray them? It's easy to paint this as cruelty, but to Anne it was justice. To her, protecting the Queen's memory was more important than sparing Harry's dignity. And in her eyes, Harry's presence was not an act of love, but an act of intrusion. The guards moved closer, their hands just shy of Harry's shoulders. His eyes widened, darting between them and his family, searching, pleading, hoping someone might intervene. William stayed silent. Charles didn't move. Camilla looked away. Even lesser royals sat rigid, unwilling to cross, and so the question hung in the air, unanswered but suffocating. Who would save him? The silence was the answer. Anne's words still echoed in the walls of the chapel, ringing louder than any hymn, any prayer, any solemn remembrance. "You destroyed the Queen." And as the guards closed in, Harry's humiliation reached its breaking point. Would he leave quietly, escorted out like an exile? Or would he resist, creating the kind of scene that would forever define his place in history? No one knew in that moment. But everyone knew one thing. Whatever Harry chose next, there would be no coming back. Because once those words were spoken, the wound could never heal. And the very next second would decide whether Harry walked out with a shred of dignity, or was dragged out in disgrace. The chapel was no longer a sanctuary of remembrance. It had become a courtroom, and had delivered the verdict. The guards, who had stood at the periphery like silent statues, now stirred into action. Their polished shoes clicked softly against the stone floor as they moved closer to Harry. The sound was faint, but in that suffocating silence, it was deafening. Think about the weight of that moment. Security guards, men trained to protect royals, to shield them from outsiders, to defend them against the world, were now being summoned to remove one of their own. A prince, the Queen's grandson. And yet, not one of them hesitated. That says everything about the authority Princess and commanded. The crowd felt the tension before a hand was even laid on Harry. Some looked away, unable to watch what they knew would be a humiliation. Others leaned forward slightly, unable to resist witnessing history in the making. Whispers fluttered through the pews like restless birds, their words indistinguishable but their tone sharp. Disbelief, dismay, maybe even satisfaction. Harry's face tightened. His jaw clenched, and his eyes darted to Anne, then to Charles, then to William. But none of them moved. Not one offered him even the faintest lifeline. He was on his own. "Are you serious?" Harry's voice broke the silence, louder now, carrying a mix of anger and desperation. "This is my grandmother. I have every right to be here." And didn't blink. She didn't waver. She simply inclined her head toward the guards, her expression icy. It wasn't rage anymore, it was finality. In her mind, the matter was settled, and the guards obeyed. One stepped to Harry's left, the other to his right, their hands held just behind him, not touching yet, but close enough to make their intentions clear. The message was unmistakable. If he refused to walk, they would make him. The symbolism was crushing. Security had once been Harry's shield. He had grown up surrounded by their protection. Their presence used to mean safety. Now, they meant rejection. Exile. Would you have walked out on your own? Or would you have resisted, daring them to drag you out in front of the world? Harry stood frozen, caught in that impossible choice. If he left quietly, the humiliation would still follow him for the rest of his life. If he resisted, he risked an even greater disgrace. Headlines screaming about a prince manhandled by guards at his grandmother's memorial. Either way, he lost. And maybe that was the point. This wasn't just about removing him from the room. It was about stripping him of power. It was about showing, in the clearest possible way, that he no longer had a place in the heart of the monarchy. This wasn't exile whispered behind palace doors. This was exile played out in front of witnesses, before the Queen's ghost, before the cameras waiting beyond Windsor's gates. The guards stepped in closer, the air around Harry tightening like a noose. His shoulders slumped for just a second, a flicker of defeat breaking through his defiance. But then, something shifted. His chin rose. His eyes flashed. He wasn't going to let them touch him, not yet. "I'll walk out myself," he muttered, the words sharp, almost spat out, as though reclaiming the smallest shred of dignity left to him. But the damage was already done. The sight of the guards hovering at his sides was enough. The image would be burned into the memory of everyone there, soon to spread beyond Windsor, across Britain, across the world. A grandson escorted out like an intruder, a prince treated like a trespasser. And as Harry rose to his feet, the sound of the pew creaking under his weight, the whispers began again. Some sympathetic, some judgmental, but all united in shock at what they had just seen. Harry turned one last time, his eyes sweeping the room, searching for a glimmer of solidarity. But there was none. William looked down. Charles's face was unreadable. Camilla whispered something to a lady beside her, and stood firm, her stare unflinching, her verdict unchanged. The guards shadowed Harry as he made his way toward the door, their presence a reminder that this wasn't his choice, not really. He could walk, yes, but he wasn't welcome, not anymore. And just as his hand touched the heavy wooden door, the moment cracked open with new tension. Because while Harry was ready to leave, not everyone in the room agreed with Anne's severity. A voice, unexpected, was about to break the silence. A voice that would complicate everything. The door was within reach. Harry's fingers brushed the wood, rough under his palm, a barrier between disgrace inside and disgrace waiting outside. But before he could push it open, he stopped. His chest rose and fell heavily, his breath shaky, and then he turned. It was a move no one expected. Most assumed he'd slink away, tail tucked, avoiding more humiliation. But Harry wasn't done. He wasn't ready to let Anne's words be the last memory stamped into this day. And so, against every instinct screaming at him to leave, he spun around to face the room. "Wait!" His voice rang out, cracking through the chapel. Gasps rippled. The guards froze, their hands hovering at his shoulders. Anne's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed tight as a vice. Charles shifted slightly in his seat, not intervening, but not looking away either. William's jaw flexed, his silence a fortress. Harry's plea began not with anger, but with raw desperation. "Please," he said, his voice trembling, echoing against the high stone walls. "I came here to honor her, to honor my grandmother. I know I've made mistakes. I know I've said things that hurt. But I loved her. More than anything, I loved her. And I couldn't stay away on a day like this." For a heartbeat, the room softened. Even those who despised him felt the sting of truth in his tone. His eyes glistened, his face cracked with vulnerability. He wasn't a prince in that moment, not a rebel, not a traitor. Just a grandson, pleading for forgiveness at his grandmother's memorial. Would you have believed him? Or would you have seen it as performance, a desperate attempt to claw back sympathy? And wasn't swayed. She folded her arms, her stare like ice. "Love," she said sharply, her voice slicing through his words. "Love doesn't tear a family apart on television. Love doesn't drag a grandmother's name through mud to sell books. Love doesn't turn grief into profit." The tension spiked. Harry's lips parted, his words fumbling out faster, less controlled. "I never wanted to hurt her. I only wanted to tell the truth, too." He stopped himself, realizing too late that invoking truth only twisted the knife deeper, and pounced. "Truth," she snapped. "Or your version of it." because what you call truth nearly broke her heart in her final years. She carried enough burdens. She didn't need yours piled on top. The chapel shuddered with silence again. Every gaze was fixed on the two of them. And, rigid and righteous, Harry, cracked and crumbling. And then CA. The words echoed, trembling with sincerity or desperation, depending on who was listening. Tears shimmered at the corners of his eyes. For the first time in a long while, Harry looked utterly undone, stripped of the bravado that usually shielded him. Some relatives glanced at one another, conflicted. A few seemed moved, their expressions softening ever so slightly. The divide was clear, pity on one side, scorn on the other. But Anne, she remained unmoved. Her face hardened further, as though each word Harry spoke was another betrayal. She leaned in, her voice low but searing. You had your chance to say goodbye. She gave you more love than you deserved, and you threw it back in her face. That door, she gestured at the heavy wood behind him, is the only place you belong now. The words landed like stones. Harry's shoulders sagged, his lips pressed tight to keep from breaking down completely. The guards, sensing the confrontation was reaching its inevitable conclusion, edged closer once more. But here's the twist. Just as they prepared to escort him out again, another sound cut through the air. A chair creaked. Someone stood. And for the first time in this entire ordeal, another royal voice entered the fray. It wasn't Charles. It wasn't William. It wasn't even Camilla. It was someone no one expected to speak at all, and their words would shift the room in ways Anne hadn't anticipated. The scrape of a chair broke the tension like a crack of thunder in the still air. Heads whipped around. Gasps fluttered through the chapel. Someone was standing. For the first time since the confrontation began, another royal was about to speak. But here's the twist. It wasn't Charles. It wasn't William. It wasn't Camilla. The king remained statuesque. The heir stared at the floor, and the queen consort avoided eye contact altogether. No. The voice that entered this storm came from someone further down the pews. A lesser-known cousin, a royal with no claim to the throne, but still blood, still family. Their words weren't loud, but they were enough to cut through the suffocating silence. Maybe let him stay. A murmur rippled. Not from conviction, not from rebellion, but from sheer shock that anyone dared contradict, and in this moment, all eyes snapped back to her. Anne's jaw set tighter, her face immovable stone. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't just Anne versus Harry. This was the family itself, silently casting their verdict. Look carefully. Charles didn't speak up. His silence was deafening. As king, he could have ended it instantly. With one word, he could have told security to stand down, could have allowed Harry to remain. But he didn't. His eyes flickered between Anne and Harry, and then lowered, as though he had chosen passivity over intervention. For Harry, that silence must have felt like abandonment. For Anne, it was permission. William stayed rigid, his knuckles white against the wood of the pew. He didn't look at his brother once. His silence screamed of betrayal remembered, of grudges never forgiven. It wasn't neutral, it was damning. His lack of defense told the entire room where he stood, not with Harry. Never again. Camilla leaned toward a lady beside her, lips moving in a whispered comment that never reached Harry's ears. But her body language, turned away, eyes narrowed, spoke volumes. She wasn't going to lend him sympathy. Not after the things he'd written about her, the insults buried in his memoir. Her silence wasn't passive. It was disdain. And so the family's verdict began to take shape. Not through shouts, not through open declarations, but through silence. A silence louder than any condemnation could ever be. This is the cruelty of family politics. Sometimes rejection doesn't come with raised voices or pointed fingers. Sometimes it comes in the form of looking away, of choosing not to defend you, of letting you twist in the wind until you finally break. That was Harry's reality in that chapel. Did he see it in their eyes? Did he feel the collective cold shoulder, the wall of indifference closing around him? Because while Anne had spoken the words, the rest of the family gave them power. By refusing to step in, by refusing to soften the blow, they were complicit. The Queen's daughter may have been the executioner, but the entire family held the rope. Harry's plea still echoed in the air. I deserve to say goodbye. But no one echoed him back. Not Charles. Not William. Not even those cousins who once laughed with him at Balmoral, who once rode horses and shared private jokes in the gardens. Their silence swallowed him whole. And that silence was the verdict. Unworthy, unwanted, unforgiven. Anne's eyes swept across the pews, daring anyone to challenge her. No one did. Even the cousin who had whispered, "Let him stay," sank back into their seat, their voice drowned in the tide of conformity. Harry's chest rose and fell, his desperation slowly collapsing into resignation. He looked around one last time, scanning faces for a flicker of support, but all he saw were turned heads, averted gazes, blank masks. Have you ever felt that kind of isolation? To stand in a room full of family and yet feel more alone than you would in the middle of a desert? To realize that the people who once lifted you now prefer to watch you fall? That's the cruelty Harry faced in that moment. The family's silent verdict wasn't just a rejection. It was a burial. They were burying him alongside the Queen's memory, not as a grandson, but as a ghost of who he once was. And as he turned back toward the door, shoulders heavy with defeat, another voice, this time not family, but from the crowd itself, broke the silence again. It wasn't royal. It wasn't polished, but it was loud enough to sting. And it reminded Harry that this wasn't just about family anymore. The whole world was watching. The silence had been suffocating, but it didn't last. A cough, a shuffle of shoes, a muttered whisper. It started small. And then, clear as a bell, a voice rose from the back of the chapel. Not royal, not rehearsed, not softened by protocol, just raw, unfiltered, and sharp enough to pierce the tension. Why is he even here? Gasps rippled through the mourners. Heads twisted, eyes widened. Some hands even darted to mouths in shock. It wasn't Justin now. It wasn't just the family. The crowd, the extended relatives, the courtiers, the household staff, even the few dignitaries permitted inside, was beginning to weigh in. And that's when it became clear, Harry wasn't just being judged by his family anymore. He was on trial before the entire institution. Think about it. Every servant who had watched the Queen's steady hand, every distant cousin who owed their position to her loyalty, every courtier who lived by her discipline, they all carried her ghost in their own way. And when they looked at Harry, many of them didn't see grief. They saw betrayal. They saw scandal. They saw the man who dragged their beloved monarch's name into endless headlines. The whispers began to swell, a tide of hushed condemnation. He shouldn't have come. Anne's right. He dishonored her. This isn't about him. It's about the Queen. The sound rolled through the chapel, not loud enough to be shouting, but steady enough to feel like a chorus. Each word, each muttered judgment, was another stone thrown at Harry, weighing him down. Would you have stood it? Would you have stayed silent under that avalanche of scorn, or would you have shouted back, daring them to face their own hypocrisy? Harry's face reddened. His lips parted, as if he might finally snap, finally spit out the anger building in his chest. But then, another voice cut through, different this time. He has a right. He's her grandson. The words came from a woman seated further back, her tone firmer, steadier. Another ripple surged through the chapel. Now it wasn't just condemnation, it was division. The room split into factions. Some muttered agreement. Others hissed their disapproval. The sacred service was unraveling into a public debate. And through it all, Harry stood frozen, his body tense, his heart pounding in his throat. He had wanted to mourn his grandmother. Instead, he was standing in the middle of a courtroom without walls, judged not only by his family, but by every eye that lingered on him. The irony couldn't be sharper. Queen Elizabeth had dedicated her life to keeping the monarchy above public squabbles, to preserving dignity at all costs. And yet here, at her own memorial, her family and courtiers were airing grievances in whispers loud enough to be heard. The institution she fought to shield was tearing itself apart in front of her portrait, and, however, remained unflinching. She didn't silence the crowd. She didn't attempt to restore decorum. In her mind, their voices only validated her own. The Queen's daughter had spoken, and the chorus rising behind her was proof. Harry was no longer welcome. But here's the cruel twist. Harry wasn't just fighting family disapproval anymore. He was battling the entire perception of the monarchy. Every glare, every whisper, every muttered word was another reminder that he wasn't just estranged, he was exiled. Still, there was another side to this crowd. Pity lingered in a few pairs of eyes. Some saw not a traitor, but a broken man. A grandson who made mistakes, yes, but who still deserved one last moment of peace. Those sympathetic whispers, though faint, carried a question that would haunt the day. Hadn't gone too far? Because here's the danger of public humiliation. It doesn't just destroy the target. It risks destroying the one who delivers it, too. And as the crowd's whispers swirled louder, one thought began to surface, unspoken but powerful. Was Princess and protecting her mother's legacy, or was she staining it with cruelty? Harry, standing at the door with the guards at his side, felt that question in every stare. His pulse hammered, his hands clenched into fists. And then, in a sudden movement, he straightened. He wasn't going to slip out quietly. Not anymore. The humiliation was unbearable, but Harry's pride wouldn't let him crumble before them all. And the choice he made in that moment, how he responded to the crowd, to his family's silence, would turn this from a scandal into a defining moment. Because instead of leaving like a disgraced guest, Harry was about to claim something back. But what came out of his mouth next, no one expected. The heavy doors loomed behind Harry, a threshold between the sanctuary of the chapel and the outside world bristling with cameras, journalists, and endless speculation. Inside, his aunt's words still echoed, "You destroyed the Queen." Outside, headlines were already being written in real time. But in that suffocating pause, with the crowd murmuring and Anne's eyes boring into him, the true meaning of the moment crystallized. This wasn't just about leaving a service. It was exile, played out in front of the Queen's ghost and her descendants. Think about the weight of exile in royal history. The Windsors know it all too well. Edward VIII, once king, cast aside the crown for love and spent the rest of his life wandering in half-light. Forever the Duke of Windsor, never again the sovereign. His story haunted the family for generations, a reminder that stepping away from the institution meant you never truly came back. And now, Harry stood in a parallel tragedy, different crown, different century, but the same symbolism. Do you see the irony? Edward's exile was self-chosen, sealed with abdication papers. Harry's was thrust upon him publicly, branded with words and silence. Both men, in their own way, were shut out from the very thing they once embodied. Inside the chapel, the symbolism thickened. The pews filled with figures who had given their lives to the monarchy, distant cousins, lifelong courtiers, diplomats who had pledged loyalty to the Queen. Their eyes weighed him down. To them, he wasn't just a grandson mourning his grandmother. He was the living embodiment of division, betrayal, disunity. He wasn't Harry the Prince anymore. He was Harry the Exile. But here's the cruelest twist. In exile, dignity matters more than anything. How you leave, how you carry yourself, becomes your final statement. And in that moment, Harry faced an impossible choice. Would he walk quietly out the doors, accepting his role as the outcast? Or would he resist, risk a physical removal that would become the single most humiliating moment in modern royal history? His chin lifted just slightly, his shoulders squared. Pride, defiance, maybe even desperation flared inside him. He wanted to claim something, anything, from the wreckage of this day. "I came here for her," Harry said suddenly, his voice steady but shaking beneath the surface. "And no matter what you think of me, nothing can change that." The crowd stirred again. Some scoffed, others murmured in approval, a few even nodded. But the words weren't for them. They were for the portrait of his grandmother that hung near the altar, her eyes captured in paint, watching silently as her family fractured in her name. That's the unbearable symbolism. Elizabeth had spent 70 years building unity, dignity, and constancy. And now, 3 years after her death, her memorial had become a theater of division, humiliation, and anger. Instead of unity and mourning, there was exile and disgrace. And stepped forward once more, her heels sharp against the stone. "You had your chance," she said coldly. "Now leave." The guards edged closer again, their presence undeniable. Harry looked at them, then at his family, then at the portrait. His breath caught, his jaw tightened, and finally, he nodded. But here's where symbolism deepened. He didn't bow. He didn't look at Charles, or William, or Anne. He didn't even look at the crowd. He turned sharply, pushed open the heavy wooden doors, and walked out under his own power. No one stopped him. No one called him back. The doors closed behind him with a groan that sounded more like a coffin sealing shut than a chapel door swinging shut. And in that sound was the symbolism of exile, finality. Inside, the service resumed, but nothing felt the same. A son had been exiled by silence. A grandson had been condemned by accusation. And the Queen's ghost hung heavier than ever, her legacy now a battlefield rather than a bridge. Outside, Harry was greeted by the blinding flash of cameras, the press roaring his name, microphones shoved toward him. He didn't stop. He didn't speak. But the photographs captured everything. The set jaw, the tightened fists, the hollow eyes. And those images, within minutes, began circling the globe. The story wasn't just about Harry anymore. It was about the monarchy itself. About whether this public humiliation strengthened the crown or revealed its cracks for the world to see. Because here's the truth about exile. It doesn't just punish the one cast out. It reshapes the entire house that casts them away. And in this case, Anne's command may have given Harry the most powerful symbolism of all. Not of a rebel, not of a prince, but of an exile whose story was far from over. But Harry wasn't done yet. Not in his heart, not in his pride. Because even as the doors closed behind him, whispers spread inside Windsor. What would he do next? Would he vanish quietly into the night? Or would he strike back in a way that no one in that chapel saw coming? The air outside Windsor hit Harry like a slap. Cold, sharp, brutal. It wasn't the chill of the autumn evening that bit at him. It was the wall of flashbulbs and shouts. Cameras exploded with light, capturing his every move, freezing his humiliation into frames that would be dissected for decades. Reporters barked questions, each one like a spear. Prince Harry, why were you escorted out? Did Princess Anne humiliate you? Do you regret coming here? He didn't answer. His jaw was locked tight, his fists clenched at his sides, his stride heavy and fast. But his silence said more than words ever could. The storm was written all over his face. Storms, after all, don't always roar. Sometimes they smolder. Sometimes they build with every step, every heartbeat, every camera flash. And Harry was a storm contained inside a suit, walking down the stone steps of Windsor, fury trailing behind him like smoke. Imagine the humiliation. For years, Harry had complained about the loss of security, about being left vulnerable. Yet here he was, escorted not as a prince, not as family, but as a liability. The irony burned. The very men who once protected him from paparazzi now shadowed him like wardens, ensuring an unwanted guest left the premises. And the whispers followed. He could hear them, even over the shutters and questions. Courtiers muttering at the doors. Distant relatives shaking their heads. A staffer hissing, unbelievable. The Queen's memorial had become a stage for his exile, and every single whisper was another nail sealing his coffin of dignity. Would you have kept walking? Or would you have stopped, turned, and shouted the truth as you saw it? For a split second, Harry almost did. His body tensed, his steps faltered, and his head turned ever so slightly back toward the chapel. The temptation was clear, to march back in, to throw their silence in their faces, to remind them that without him, without Diana's son, the monarchy was incomplete. But pride stopped him, or maybe fear, or maybe the realization that the cameras were waiting, hungry for a meltdown. Instead, he pressed forward, his strides quickening until they were almost stomps, his polished shoes clattering against the cobblestones. And then came the car. A sleek black vehicle idled at the curb, its driver stiff at the wheel, eyes averted. The door swung open, inviting him in, a dark cavern of escape. For a moment, Harry stood frozen on the steps, framed by the flash of cameras, torn between disappearing into the car or facing the press. His chest heaved, his face twitched. The storm inside him begged for release. And then it broke. He spun toward the cameras, his eyes blazing, his voice hoarse but fierce. I loved my grandmother, he snapped, each word clipped and raw. Don't you dare question that. Gasps erupted. Cameras surged forward. The press roared louder. It wasn't much. It wasn't the confession or breakdown they were hoping for, but it was enough. Enough to ignite headlines. Enough to prove he wasn't leaving in silence. Enough to show the storm wasn't contained after all. But that one outburst wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Because storms don't end with one clap of thunder. They linger. They rage on the horizon. And as Harry ducked into the car, slamming the door behind him, the storm didn't dissipate. It moved. Inside the car, his fist struck the seat. His breath came in sharp bursts. Rage, humiliation, grief, betrayal, all tangled inside him, consuming him whole. Through the tinted windows, Windsor shrank behind him. The castle that had once been home was now nothing more than a fortress that spat him out. A prison he no longer had the keys to. And that's when it hit him. He wasn't just leaving Windsor. He was leaving behind any illusion of return. This wasn't a temporary exile anymore. It was permanent. Anne's words, the family's silence, the crowd's whispers, they had sealed his fate. But storms don't just destroy. They also strike back. And in that car, Harry's mind turned not to retreat, but to retaliation. He wasn't finished. He wouldn't let this be the final word. If they thought they could humiliate him into silence, they were wrong. The Storm W.